Hello, students. My name is Gon Hwang. I'm a composer and jazz pianist, and I am also a conductor and educator. Today, through this lecture, I'd like to talk about the compositional tendency of the French composer named Claude Debussy. Probably you have heard about his name a little bit. As we know, he is one of the famous Impressionism composers like Ravel. Of course, I absolutely agree with that idea. But today, through this lecture, I'd like to have a different opinions about his compositional techniques. So if you listen to this lecture from the beginning to the end, you're going to see what the new approach to his music is. Basically, I designed this lecture especially for the intermediate level of music majors, but at the same time, this lecture will be also adequate for non-majors for their liberal arts class. If this is a liberal arts class, it would be a little difficult, especially for those who have never taken this kind of classes before. Okay, let's get started. To begin with, let's talk about the composer himself a little bit. According to the historical records, he was born in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France, in 1862. He is sometimes considered to be a real founder of modern Western European music. When Debussy began his career, almost every composer in that period was trying to find a way to break through the limitations of the musical expression of the time. In that period, the highly elaborated chromaticism of late Romantic music prevailed and had reached its limit already because it was so developed and practiced. The prelude of the opera called Tristan und Isolde is the most adequate work to support this idea. The piece was written in 1865. Okay, now let's listen to this music a little bit. While listening to this music, please observe how intense the chromaticism that I talked about is. Okay, so how do you think about this music? Did you have any specific feelings about this music? Did you have any special ideas and thoughts about this music? As for me, I think this music is pretty emotional. It has some kind of a heroic atmosphere in the music. And also, as mentioned earlier, there were very chromatic passages in the music. Of course, we didn't listen to the entire prelude, but I think we were able to sense that kind of chromaticism from that music. However, I want you to know that this is not a lecture about the chromaticism itself, so we don't have to be so focused on this music and chromaticism itself. But if possible, probably I'm going to talk about this music and chromaticism a little bit more later. So anyhow, this kind of tendency was losing its effectiveness due to the overuse of chromaticism in the last period of 19th century. So, in other words, the technique named chromaticism was so developed and practiced by so many composers in so many musical works. Therefore, a group of composers finally started to suggest new alternatives to replace the old idea or technique called chromaticism. Conclusively, I'd like to say that Debussy is the most remarkable composer among those composers. Now, let's talk about paintings a little bit. You know, actually paintings and music are very closely related to each other. When you look into other artistic genres like painting, you could understand more about music, especially in terms of relationship between different artistic genres. Around late 19th and early 20th century in painting, a similar phenomenon occurred like in music. Around the end of 19th century, a group of painters were trying to escape from the Romanticism style, such as Caspar David Friedrich. Before we talk about the painters, let's study Romanticism in paintings a little bit more. Like the music of Romanticism painters considered emotion, madness, mysticism, and free form more valuable. At the same time, this tendency meant anti-neoclassicism, which prevailed just before it in Europe. The next picture is one of the paintings painted by the famous Romanticism painter named Caspar David Friedrich. Let's look into this picture carefully together. As you can see, the title of this painting is Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog. As mentioned earlier, like the music of Romanticism, do you remember the Prelude from the opera called Tristan und Isolde, composed by a German composer Richard Wagner? Do you remember that? Likewise, this painting is quite emotional and free in terms of form and texture. So, please look at those strong rocks and the vast mountains. And also look at the main character standing on the rock. He seems like he is facing undeniable destiny that will overwhelm him shortly. So, probably I may say that this picture has some kind of a heroic atmosphere in it to some degree, right? Okay, now let's talk about the painters who wanted to avoid the artistic view of Romanticism. Around the end of 19th century, they finally created a new aesthetical stream called Impressionism. This is very important, right? Especially in the art history, including music and paintings. According to their idea, painters should be more focused on the impressions, which was derived from the materials or nature or the painter's environments, okay? Which was derived from the materials rather than the inner world of human beings. They also thought that light, sunlight or, artificial light, whatever it is, light is a very important element in their paintings because the impression could be made fundamentally by light. I think this is very interesting. Therefore, they decomposed the shape of materials into pixels rather than lines and planes. Light can make us perceive materials as pixels rather than lines and planes because the shapes of materials reflected by light are more concrete than the shapes of materials decomposed by lines and planes. That is to say that tremendous amount of tiny pixels can make a shape of a material more concrete and more in detail and more real, I think. The next example is the painting titled Circus Sideshow, painted in 1889 by an Impressionist named Georges Shara. I'm not so sure about this French pronunciation, but anyhow, let's look at the picture together. At a glance, it could be easily recognized that the visual contours in this painting are not very clear. Almost every outlines of the characters and materials in this painting are somewhat vague, right? Okay, now let's expand the face of the man in the right side of the painting. Okay, if you look at this picture very carefully, as shown here, instead of seeing kind of a clear outlines of the man, here we just can see the countless amount of tiny pixels that form the man's shape. I think this is very interesting. This technique is actually called Pointillism. And according to some music theorists, this technique called Pointillism could be also found in Debussy's compositions. Of course, Debussy's music is not paintings, right? So probably that technique could have been changed into a different artistic form, which is just for music. Now, regarding this matter, let's look into the piano piece called Reflection in the Water. This piece is the first movement of the piano suite named Image 1, and this piece was composed in 1905 by Debussy. And probably this piece is one of the most important pieces which is representing the musical impressionism of Debussy. While listening to this music, I think it's not that hard for you to know that the traditional chord progressions based on triads do not appear anymore. In other words, chords like tonic, subdominant, and dominant triads are difficult to be observed. In a way, it's almost impossible to recognize. Now let's examine this musical excerpt from the whole to the parts very carefully. It is somewhat easy to know that the tonal center is in D flat, because when you look at the beginning part, D flat appears from the very beginning of the piece, and it is establishing the centricity, and that centricity is being supported by the stacked A flat over D flat. The interval of D flat and A flat is sounding like a triad in a way, without a third, in a traditional sense of harmony. The tone D flat as a central tone is also verified by the key signature, which was written on the score by the composer himself. However, still something covers the tonal structure. Okay, now let's move on a little bit further. To analyze this music more effectively, I think the bar 3 and 4 need to be observed. When you listen to this spot, it can be recognized that D flat is still the tonal center, although various chordal changes are being perceived. In order to understand this phenomenon, I made a score reduction like the below. If you listen to the music again in the version of the reduced score, it will be recognized that D flat major triad keeps sounding in spite of the continuously changing sound of the right hand part. If this is true, the chord tones and non-chord tones of D flat major triad can be sorted out as follows. The tones with the diamond shape mean non-chord tones of D flat major triad. Of course, the tones with regular notation mean the chord tones of the chord. Okay, now let's think about this in a vertical form as seen below. The sound of D flat and A flat clearly remind us of the root and fifth of the major triad. The notes of diamond shape are still the same, found in the previous score, but the squared tone did not show in the actual music at all. Why is that? What's the purpose of the square tone? The purpose of the square tone is to show the triadic structure of the entire chord. Because of the existence of the square tone, it could be easily understood that the highest B flat is the 13th tone among other chord members. Usually those 9th, 11th, and 13th tones are called editone. Okay, now let's listen to this chordal sound together. Listen to this very carefully. So, what is your feeling about this chord? How did you listen to this chordal sound? I think probably you were able to sense a kind of a triadic atmosphere from the chord, right? But simultaneously, something is different, right? Something is still vague, right? Something is unclear. I mean, in other words, for me, it seems like a kind of a cloud is covering something, which used to be very clear. But by the way, what is the difference between added tones and non-harmonic tones? Have you ever thought about this? To make long story short, as shown below, non-harmonic tones always need resolution, but added tones do not. So this is a key to understand the difference. In this example, when you look at the tone with the circle, you see that it will be resolved to the next tone, A flat, with the square. Although the tone with the circle is a 13th, it cannot be considered as an added tone because it is resolved to the next tone, which is the 5th in the D flat major triad. Now let's go back to the George Shara's painting. The purpose of Pointillism is to blur a clear outline in a refined manner. As mentioned earlier, this technique is also associated with the fact that the painters of Impressionism wanted to see materials as countless pixels rather than the lines and planes. In this context, it could be concluded that Impressionist painting had a direct influence on Debussy's composition. However, I think there are still suspicious aspects to be noted. For example, Impressionist painting is visual, right? But as we know, Debussy's technique is purely oral. If so, visual characteristics in his music need to be proved to validate the connection between Impressionism and Debussy. Of course, it is true that there are many works like Reflection of the Water, which took visual elements as compositional motive. However, his most representative work called Prelude for the Afternoon of a Faun has direct connection with the poem rather than painting. The poem was written by Stepan Mallarmé, who is one of the most powerful symbolism poets. If this is true, then we need to check a possibility about whether the piece was influenced by any poems of symbolism. According to many music history books, Mallarmé had a great influence on French composers like Ravel, Milhaud, and even Boulez. Of course, one over Debussy is remarkable. Now, let's discuss the characteristics of symbolism poems a little bit. The artistic stream started around the late 19th century from the poem titled The Flower of Evil, which was written by Pierre Baudelaire in 1857. The poets in this tendency try to reach reality through elusive and symbolic expressions rather than direct and explanative ways. They believed that indirectness through symbolic expressions was the key to open the door of true reality. According to historical records, one of the symbolists named John Moreas declared the famous Symbolist manifesto in Le Figaro in 1886. It says that in this art, scenes from nature, human activities, and all other real-world phenomena will not be described for their own sake. However, here, they are perceptible surfaces created to represent their esoteric affinities with the primordial ideas. Yeah, I think this is a pretty deep and profound philosophical concept which cannot be understood easily. However, conclusively, at least they were trying to avoid direct and concrete expressions and rather create indirect symbols to assimilate more to the original meanings of the universe. In conclusion, the key word for symbolism is indirectness. Indirectness. I think this term could be a key to open the world of Debussy. So now let's go back to the editones. And please think about triads here. In this perspective, I think triads are like the direct expression that symbolists wanted to avoid. However, the technique of editones could be a method to create the indirectness, which is like the one the symbolists were trying to convey. Okay, now I'd like to talk about another compositional aspect of Debussy. So I brought one more piano piece. So now let's listen to this music together. Actually, this is the second movement of Prelude Book 1. Although this excerpt is pretty short, but in a way it is enough for us to sense a kind of compositional tendency and techniques of Debussy. Regarding this, I extracted every individual note that was used from bar 1 to 4, like the below. As you can see, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tones in that tone system. Probably this could be some kind of scale, definitely. So now, in the next diagram, I'd like to show you the intervallic structure of the tone system or scale, like the below. This tone system or scale is called actually whole tone scale. And every adjacent interval in the scale is a whole step or major second. This kind of unique scale has several distinctions. This scale has only 2 different key areas, unlike the other scales like major scale, which has 12 different keys. And there's no leading tone in this scale because, of course, there's no minor second in it. Usually, if there's no leading tone in a scale, the scale is supposed to lose its centricity systematically because there's no leading function in that scale. In this case, the leading function is a tendency of moving to tonic. Therefore, if there's no function like that, tonic easily gets weak, and the centricity, which is possibly associated with tonic, could be vague. This phenomenon can also be interpreted by the concept of indirectness, which I already talked about. So, conclusively, to make chordal indirectness, I think Debussy used the technique of additones. And also to make a melodic indirectness, I think he used whole tone scale. Okay, now let's gather every note in the last bar of the previous example, like the below. This tone collection is named pentatonic scale, actually. In this scale, there's no leading tone like the previous scale called whole tone scale. As mentioned earlier, the fact that there's no leading tone means that there's no tonic, or any tone can be a tonic, in other words. Conclusively, this phenomenon can also be translated by the concept of indirectness. So probably you still remember the philosophical term indirectness, right? The indirectness can be a core concept of symbolism, and also at the same time, indirectness could be a keyword for us to understand the compositional tendency of Debussy. So I'd like to say that ultimately Debussy was trying to make indirectness or some kind of vagueness, especially by using pentatonic scale, because there is no clear centricity in that scale. So now I brought an excerpt from the piano piece called Shara Band, which is the second movement of the piano suite titled For the Piano. And also this piece was written in 1901 by the composer. If you look at the bar 3 and 4, a kind of parallel technique appears accompanying the main melody, and the main melody mainly appears in the right hand part. Below is the reduced score of this excerpt. If you look at the reduced score carefully, you would easily know that all 6 chords are in the form of dominant seventh, and their adjacent intervals are all whole staff, like whole tone scale. This chordal technique is very unique and one of the representing compositional idioms of Debussy, which is named parallel chords. As assumed, this also can make very untraditional and non-functional chord progression. ultimately, this chord progression can create the chordal indirectness like the previous technique does. So now, I think this is the time to make some conclusion here. I think the elusive way of expression derived from the aesthetics of symbolism deeply affected Debussy in that he created a kind of musical indirectness in agreement with the symbolism philosophy. To create the musical indirectness, I think he used techniques like additones, whole tone scale, pentatonic scale, and parallel chords. Besides this, he also used church modes and compound rhythms, which are also the representative techniques of Debussy. It is quite clear that Debussy was deeply influenced by symbolism while he was trying to find an alternative to replace the worn-out chromaticism. It seems like the subtle expression of symbolism was a perfect solution to him because he was so tired of German Romanticism, which exhibited excessively direct and expanded expressions. So like I said, this is the time to wrap up. So at this moment, I may say that if the term indirectness can be a crucial keyword for Debussy's music, it is quite plausible to say that Debussy is a symbolist rather than an impressionist. Of course, I know there might be many different ideas about this, but at least I think Debussy was trying to make a kind of a new aesthetical viewpoint because he felt that late Romantic period music was already worn out. So he was trying to make a new approach to replace, to recover the worn out aesthetical techniques and philosophy.